I am Rosamund King, and I'm very excited about this event. I'm a professor in the English department and the incoming director of the Wolf Institute. This is, I think, the last event, right, of the Distinguished Scholar in Residence, the Hess Distinguished Scholar in Residence. So Edwidge Danticat has been with us, as you know, for the entire week, very generously giving up her time to our students and faculty and community. And we're going to have a conversation today between Edwidge and Madeline Theien, who we're also super excited to welcome to campus as our newest faculty member in the English department, teaching in the fiction MFA program. So what's going to happen today, and I will say, I know some of you have to leave a little bit early, either to go to another event or to go to another class. We know. So it's okay, just be as quiet as you can as you file out. That's perfectly fine. What's going to happen is I'm going to give brief introductions to our guests. I am going to take the liberty as the moderator of asking the first question, but then I'm going to open it up for them to ask each other questions, to have, this is meant to be a conversation, and also to open it up to you. This event is special because it is the one event for the whole week that is focused on the craft of writing. And often when you are a writer who is a woman of color, all people talk about is the content of your writing, which is super interesting and amazing, and they tell fabulous stories, right? But we don't always, my students in the room know this, I say, we don't always talk about the craft. And so I'm just going to ask you to focus your questions for today on the craft. How does that sound? Yeah. Woo. Great, great. So, Edwidge Danticat needs no introduction, but I'm going to give one anyway. She's the author of many books, including Breath Eyes Memory, which was an Oprah Book Club selection, Craft, which was a National Book Award finalist, The Farming of Bones, The Dew Breaker, and this book, which inspired our title for today, Create Dangerously, The Immigrant Artist at Work. She is the editor of The Butterfly's Way, Voices from the Haitian Diaspora in the United States, Best American Essays 2011, Haiti Noir, and Haiti Noir 2 from Akashic Books, which is based in New York. She has written 6 books for children and young adults, including Anacona, Behind the Mountains, 8 Days, The Last Mapu, and Mama's Nightingale, as well as the travel narrative After the Dance, which I've taught in my class on Carnival. Her memoir, Brother, I'm Dying, was a 2007 finalist for the National Book Award and 2008 winner of the National Book Critics Circle Award for Autobiography. She's also a MacArthur Fellow, also known as the Genius. And our new faculty member, Madeline Theien, this is her very first semester on campus, so walk up and say hello afterwards, was born in Vancouver, Canada. She is the author of the story collection Simple Recipes and 3 novels, Certainty, Dogs at the Perimeter, which was shortlisted for Berlin's International Literature Prize and winner of the Frankfurt Book Fair's Literaturpreis. As well as Do Not Say We Have Nothing, which was shortlisted for the Booker Prize. Her books and stories have been published in Canada, the US, the UK, Australia, and have been translated into 25 languages. Madeline's literary criticism, essays, and multimedia work on topics such as music and human rights, personhood, female beauty, state surveillance, visual art, race, literary politics, neighborhoods, and the Quebec Rodeo are widely available in venues such as The Guardian, Granta, Financial Times, PEN America, and Brick, where she is also a contributing editor. All right, so people, I'm going to get straight into it because we don't have that much time. People often assume that great writers roll out of bed, yawn, and pour perfect prose onto the page. So I'd like for you to start by talking a little bit about your revision process. How much of what we end up seeing in your books is rewriting, and how much of the writing, some people they write in their head and they revise in their head. What is your revision process?
First of all, good afternoon to all of you. Thank you, Rosamund. Thank you, Madeline. It's wonderful to be here with all of you. I want to know who these people are who think that writers roll out of bed at all, right? My revision process is extremely involved. So Usually I start by doing what Annie Lamont calls a shady first draft, right? I try to go through with the fervor that got me to begin through a first draft and try to like plow through, and then I go back and revise relentlessly. And I usually overwrite, I write everything that comes, and so that I can have the luxury of revising, and I try to revise to a point where I feel like every word counts. So that's really my process.
Also, good afternoon. I'm so glad to be here. I'm so honored to have this conversation with you both. It's really been a thrilling week listening to Edwidge in the different forms that she's been here, and I'm so thrilled the college thought to bring her here. Wise and brilliant move. I am always feeling my way through in the dark, it seems, and I think of it as sort of I have a very spatial way of moving through fiction, and it feels to me always like I'm moving through a house or a room that I can't quite see, and I'm always sort of looking for the door. And if I find the one that connects one room to the other, I might have a sense of what this story is. I tend to do a really kind of distressing process of throwing out a lot of work. I write, finish, throw it out, write, finish, throw it out, and so on. But for me, it's almost a process of distillation so that I can see clearer and clearer each time I enter into that space.
And for both of you, when you throw something out or you delete something, does it go away? Mm-hmm. Or do you save that in another file or another notebook to potentially become a story or something else?
I don't delete them, but I find that I rarely go back to look at them. Sometimes I'll go back much later, and what I've realized that my process is not good for is that some of the rawness gets stripped away. And in the last, so now it's been a 20-year writing life so far for me, and I think in the last 5 or 7 years, I throw out a bit less, but I move forward a bit more cautiously. I need to feel like the foundation is strong. And in those deleted files, even if I wanted to bring it back into the new work, I couldn't, because something about the intonation of the voice is subtly off. It can't just be brought in its wholeness back into where the work has gone.
Sometimes when I delete chunks and I'm very certain in the moment that it's useless, and then I go back and I miss it, and I'm doing that thing where you want to call the tech person to find you the last 5 generations of the thing. And so from that whole like chaos, I've started to save some versions. Like I'll call it A, or I'll call it B. And sometimes I do go back and then just to make sure that I don't miss it. But I always feel like the work benefits from my having written it. And I was just saying that to someone earlier, is that I feel like if you write a full description of somebody in a story, even if you don't use that whole thing, even if you keep 2 or 3 of that, then that person is fully formed in your mind and informs the way that you move forward. So I do think there's a way that even deleted text is still in the text, like is in the subtext. The fact of it having been written means that it somehow exists in the story somehow, whether it's read or not.
We have questions from the audience. Ellen.
So it sounds to me, talking both of you about character and plot and perhaps dialogue, figuring out where a story is going. What about stylistic craft questions? Do you reserve those for later, or do you change sentences around, change words around as you're proceeding?
For me, the first draft is always like where you just figure out like your way to that door in the dark. And you just kind of, I try to just plow through because I'm always worried about losing the story. And I remember reading a Joan Didion essay one time where she said she was worried, like, especially towards the end, that if she goes to dinner, you lose what you could have written that night, and when you come back, it's another thing. So I always have that anxiety. And before I had my children, I would always say, like, I'm not going to go outside because I don't want to get hit by a bus before now I have other reasons for worrying about getting hit by the bus. But I used to just like, oh my gosh, I don't want to die before I write, I'm always like on the edge about losing the story. So the first draft is that for me, to just get it down. And then the going back, and what I find even more exciting is that point where you're adding layers, where you're just really paying attention to a specific image or the language and where this word goes, and sometimes you're just moving around this one word that would make no difference to anybody else. That part is almost like when a sculptor takes a big piece of stone and they start hammering away, and then gradually the thing emerges, and then you do the details, then you do the polish, and then until you're worried about the nails on the sculpture and things of that nature. So I feel like it's this amorphous thing that you chisel away, but I have to get that. I have to find the rock first, and that for me is that first draft.
It's a great question, and it's one I struggle with because for me they're so inextricable. Style, character, dialogue, setting, conceptual framework, ideas, even the ethical world or the non-ethical world in which they're trying to make sense of things. And I can't quite separate it from the sentence-by-sentence detail work. So I think that's why my process tends to be so extreme with throwing things out, because it just keeps, it all goes back to the sentences line by line. And I love your stone carving metaphor, because I think of it that way too, and I also think of it like painting. And what I feel like I'm constantly doing is walking up close to it and then stepping back further away, because you're trying to hold in your head the whole time the large scale work and the detail work. And so like you just have this constant shifting of stepping back, going forward, adding something, stepping back, getting rid of it all. So, all that kind of stuff. Yeah.
You mentioned kind of gesture towards the specificity of particular words. And I believe that both of you have some facility with at least 2, if not 3 languages. And one of our themes for today is the immigrant artist. So I'm curious about how, even if you're not fluent in another language, how those other languages affect how you write in English.
Well, to carry forth your metaphor of painting, it's like that notion of painting, like pentimento, right? When you take off the first canvas, and then you find, or when the first surface wears away and they find that the artist had painted over some other image that then is like demanding to come to the surface. I think the language works in the same way for me, at least, that the Creole works that way, and that even the phrasing. Sometimes when I'm tired, I will say to my, I'll say like the professor of my daughter, and then it's like and then I realize I'm having this whole grammatical, I'm speaking English in this whole grammatical sentence structure that's French or Creole, and it's when I just started, like almost all my sentences were would be, he started to walk, and I realized it was like commencer à marcher from the French, or commencer à marcher from the Creole, and then so. Things like that, I think, are always under there, and sometimes to the detriment of the other language, because you're bringing in a sort of a complication that the other language doesn't have, but sometimes also it beautifies it. And a Creole is a very visual, a very poetic language, so what people sometimes mistake as lyricism with what I'm doing is just like people speaking Creole that I'm translating. So I think that's all, that the other language, of course, is always, it's like the English, that's the beauty of English too, is that you have Toni Morrison's English, you have Shakespeare's English, you have the rapper's English, you have, So there's like this whole range. You have Sandra Cisneros, her English with the Spanish behind it, or Juno Diaz, and so I think that there's also there's room for these other languages to underneath it.
You know, I was raised entirely in English, so it's my mother tongue, and my mother speaks Cantonese and my father speaks Hakka. So I would hear my mother's Cantonese when she spoke with her sisters, or sometimes they had Hong Kong satellite television. So basically, my Cantonese was, I was able to order food, and I was able to say things like, borrowed from television, "You killed my grandfather, and now I will take my revenge." You know, that was the extent of my Cantonese. Yeah. And what was strange about the English was because it was my parents' second or third language, they felt extremely not complete in it. And you know, there was a panel the other day about immigration, and when the young women were talking about being the translators for their parents, that really struck a chord, because that was my role as a child, was to write the official letters, respond to the official things, make sure my parents were okay in these kinds of situations where they felt that the not being able to speak the language well would cause some detriment to the family or to themselves or to their dignity. So I have a kind of mixed up language relationship with English, in that it's entirely my mother tongue, but I feel like it's inflected by the beings of my parents, and that means that my English is also full of silences. And what I came to understand much later, after my mom had passed away, was one thing I had forgotten about her Cantonese was like the kind of metamorphosis that happened when she was speaking Cantonese. In English, she was so reserved, so afraid of making a mistake. In Cantonese, she is a riot. I mean, she's hilarious. Her hands wave around. She's shouting. She's always joking. She loves puns, you know. And I had to find a way to let that into my English writing when I was describing things, because my writing really had been very humorless for the first 2 or 3 books. It was like I didn't know how to be funny in English. But once I realized that I was in some mode of translation all the time, and that that the English language is a flexible thing, it could hold them too if I could just find the way. And then, like, I discovered there was wit here that I just hadn't known how to express.
In the Art of Death, I write about that with my mother's humor, and I write, like in the book, I write, my mother wouldn't have been funny in English, and it always cracks me up when I'm reading her parts from the book in English. I'm like, Mommy, you were funny in English. She would have loved to know that. Yeah, my mother used to literally say to us, she's like, I know maybe 100 English words. I'm not going to waste them on you all. So you better learn some Creole. to all of us. Yeah.
I have a friend whose native language is Tagalog, and she said that when she realized her mother didn't understand irony, because that wasn't something that was that appears frequently in Tagalog, it like changed her life, and she was able to communicate better with her mother. So, questions from the audience?
Yeah. Do you have any tips on writer's block, or when you're trying to get your thoughts on paper, but you don't know how to get your thoughts on paper, like what you write seems different from your thoughts?
I don't know. We're having speaker's block. Writer's block. I got the best advice on writer's block from a professor I had in college, but it wasn't writer's block that I had. What I had was that I would always start with this like enthusiasm. I was like, I love this, and then I would get like 3 pages in and I would get stuck. And it was continuous. And then my teacher said, you just have to, first thing, and I think maybe this advice could apply to writer's block too, is that you have to accept that it's never going to be like you imagine, right? That, and her rationalization, and it's helped me a lot, is that the mind is infinite, right? We can imagine anything. We can make anything happen. But there are only so many words in any language, right? So you're already working with, to realize you were already working with some kind of deficit with what you wanted, with what you're imagining and what's going to be on the page. And you try to get it as close to that as possible. But sometimes you're blocked because the thing hasn't ripened enough. Maybe it's not ready yet, or so then when I'm in that situation, I read, I go about my life and and then your things pop up like in unexpected way, or you can be very arbitrary about it. You can say, I'm gonna do my Julia Cameron morning pages, right? I'm gonna do prompts. I'm gonna do free writing. You can give yourself assignments like that if you want to do it like that. If you want to be more, and one thing I think they don't teach writers enough is discipline, right? That it's like you have to have discipline like anything else. Like you can't just sit down. If you want to be, if this is like what you're going to do with your life, you can't just wait when you're inspired. Maybe you could just you sit down at a certain time every day, give yourself that. It's like, was it Cheever who just kind of got dressed up and went to an office every day or something like that? Sometimes you have to do things that are arbitrary when you're blocked to kind of get yourself out of that block. To be like, I'm going to give myself an assignment, I'm going to take a class, or I'm going to do things that force me out of that space.
Yeah, those are all great suggestions. I definitely recommend the reading and walking. I always highly recommend walking, going for a long walk. But I have a feeling it happens also sometimes when you're sort of putting things together and you get to a point where you're kind of forcing it. Like these things are not quite alive yet, and so you're just trying to force it into a shape and you get stuck and you get blocked. And then what do you do? I always feel like if I'm at a problem on page 5, it's probably because the difficulty is actually on page 2. And that's something that I kind of tried to slide through that doesn't really work with the cohesive structure of the person or the place or something about the world that's being built. And I have to go back there and rethink what I thought I was doing. And then the more alive it becomes, the more you get into that state where you want to be at your desk every morning at 7 a.m. because you want to know what's going to happen. You want to, you get so excited and pulled into it. You want to see what new idea is going to rise, what is going to happen, what will be said and done, because it's real. It's, yeah.
You want to see what comes next.
I was interested in what your relationship is with research for the stories that you're writing. Kind of like what kind of research it is that you do on stories, and also, do you write your first draft first and then learn kind of what it is that you need to know more about, or do you have an idea and then kind of do the research and then write?
I love research. I really love research. It's a great procrastinating tool. But it also opens up a story in so many different ways. And I find that research is so relatively easy now, right? So, and if I want to know what a street in a particular town in Brazil looks like, I can Google map, right? And there's just so much out. So you might be, the temptation of that is sometimes when I write longhand my first draft, and then my second draft is like a typing at the computer. So I might get to a point where I was like, oh, let me find out what that day was like in 19. And then the sun has gone up and down, and I'm still doing the research. But I find that none of that is, it can get carried away, but I like the notion of the more information you have. And sometimes you find some beautiful things when in doing research, and sometimes not even research, you stumble into it. For example, when I was writing the Dew Breaker, I went to the museum where they have the ancient Egyptian display there, and I was standing in front of it, and I was like, yes, the father is in front of it, and I spent 3 months researching ancient Egypt, right? And maybe I used a paragraph of it, but it became so much part of my life. It became part of the identity of the story. So I really love doing research, and I think you can use research in a way to add so many layers to your story. Again, even if it doesn't end up in the page, but I always feel like it fills it in, the more you know, and it's and don't assume you know everything and a certain thing. Like someone will point out to you that cement is not concrete, concrete is not cement, a river is not a lake is not a river. So I also think it's good to do a kind of research in the way that it's like a little fact checking after, to make sure that certain kind of, like, you have certain things right as well.
Yeah, I love the research. I mean, and I because for a long time I was very nomadic, so I was just sort of wandering a lot. And when I wrote, I have a novel called Dogs at the Perimeter, which is about the aftermath of the Cambodian genocide and the Cambodian Civil War. And it meant that I was spending months, sometimes as long as 5 months at a time in Cambodia. But for me, it's funny with the word research. I almost resisted a bit because it's so much a part of your life. It's like you're there, yes, you're writing, but you also have other questions, and you're also living your life while you're there, and it's also pushing you to think and ask questions that you didn't know you had. And I think that's one of the really powerful things of research, is that you go in thinking. That's what I feel like. I'm never going in looking for a piece of knowledge or information. I'm going in with a question, and I want to see what's out there, and I know that the answer, if one ever comes, will be a very long time coming, and probably not to the question I thought I was asking. And I think it's almost that part of the novelist's. It is almost so much part of being a novelist. You are so interested in what one, by fortune or misfortune, lives or doesn't live. And you put yourself in proximity to things knowing that you know almost nothing. I feel lucky. I feel like it's one of those vocations that lets you not ever be one thing.
Beyond kind of Google and paper. So have you interviewed people? Have you talked to people kind of in your circle or in your family as research? Have you gone to have experiences as research? And does that function in essentially the same way or a different way than kind of Googling something or looking something up in a book?
I mean, you also, I think, is part of what we're calling research is maybe pre-research is observation, right? To being somebody in general, as an artist or as a writer in your life, upon whom nothing is wasted, right? So you're just like, you're aware of your environment, you're not always on your phone, as we tell the young people. But to just be observant, like sometimes you're on a bus, and looking around you, looking at the people sitting around you, and I've found the faces of a lot of characters that way, just by being observant. I think that's a kind of information intake, if you will, just living in the world and fully participating in the world and just being present in the places where you are. The other kind, like when you have a project and you said, I'm going to write about this particular era, that is a more focused kind of thing, and then you go, the first kind of type of research like that, I think it's just being in the place. And like, for example, when I was researching the forming of bones, I knew I was several decades removed from that time, but standing in the place, there's something about having your foot on that ground in the place that just does something, especially if you have a spiritual, some kind of historical connection to that place. I felt like more than the information I knew, the stuff from the book, just even before I knew it, but having touched that place was very different. So I think also like lived experience, like interacting fully and emotionally with the thing that you're writing about is a kind of, information and take in. Of course, you interview people if you're writing a historical novel and you try to get their take, knowing that whatever you create will be something other than because you're not a journalist really, and you'll be doing something more impressionistic, but you take all that information with you, all the physical, also the smells, the taste, the food, but physically touching the place if you can.
I am so awful at interviews. I knew I should have done them throughout especially the last two books. But I don't know if it's cultural. I have a really hard time asking someone a direct question. I feel like whatever the person wants to talk about is what I want to talk about, you know. So I had spent many years in China, traveling in China, and thinking about the Cultural Revolution and the 1989 demonstrations. And the interesting thing there was some of the questions I might have wanted to ask were about things that were so politically sensitive that I didn't want to put someone in a position of wanting to answer, not wanting to answer, putting themselves in jeopardy by giving an answer. And so in a way it was good because it meant that you had to absorb everything else about what you were saying about just observing how people move through a space, what happens when they see a poster of propaganda, or how they move around these spaces that evoke the past and they're all around them, but can't really be talked about in direct ways. And that, I think, that kind of perceptiveness and observation, and just also knowing that what you think you're seeing may not be what is actually happening. Not going in and projecting onto a place, making a lot of assumptions about who people are, why they don't speak, all sorts of things. It's like really holding back from projecting what your limited knowledge onto a place. Libraries. I'm really like, I think the Google research is really great for lots of great things, lots of data specific things and all. But like just going onto those stacks, and because it's usually the books around them that are the ones you end up because you don't know they exist. That's the stacks. I mean, just wandering the stacks and the depth of knowledge and scholarship and ways of thinking from different eras in those libraries. It's my God, it's paradise in there. You know, it's a treasure.
Hi. I'm very curious as to how harsh criticisms shape how you write. Like, do you write to please other people, or do you write and trust what you want? Like, basically, do you write? I'm sorry. Do you care what others think? Does it really matter what other people think? Basically, that's what I'm talking about.
Well, that's the thing is, you know, it's true, like that cliche. You cannot please all of the people all of the time. I think it's important to know that there will always be criticism. You will always get criticism, and you might as well go in with that assumption. And that's the part, I think, one of the useful tools of MFA programs is, because it's like boot camp for criticism, right? When you're in workshop, because you will get criticism, and when if you're in an MFA program long enough, then you know, okay, I'm gonna get that criticism from Joanne. I know what this one's gonna say. If you're together long enough, but there will always be criticism, and you can learn from certain kind of critique, right? There's certain kind that can help you grow. Sometimes we know, like when you're writing, like when the book is coming out, you know that there's a part like, you're like, gosh, I wish I had had a chance to, and that's the one everybody critiques, right? You're like, man, I wish I had had another shot at that. And then when they say it, it becomes glaringly obvious that you know, that the criticism is valid, that this person is addressing your work, that they're addressing it seriously. So that kind of criticism can be helpful. And I'm not one of those writers. There are writers who say, I don't read the things. I read the things. Because I think you can kind of grow from that kind of, you know, smart criticism where somebody has taken their time and read your book and addressed it, you know, but there's always things like that, you know, where people will just like the criticism will be like, oh, she's a shitty writer, she does it. And so there's nothing you can do with that. But I don't think that should affect the stuff you can grow from, you take it, you learn from it, but the other stuff that, you know, you can't write to please people. You have to write what feels real to you, what feels true to you, the best thing you can write. I mean, that's all you can do. That's all we can control as writers. We can control what we produce. We can't control the rest of it.
Yeah, and you know, there's a kind of interesting meta thing happening in a workshop. You hear the critique, there's lots of critique, but you're also hearing something else underneath, which is what each person thinks a story is, or what each person thinks a story should do or should be, and what they want from the act of literature. You're also hearing that, you know, and I think that is also a really interesting conversation happening under the surface, which can give you interesting ways to play with what you think a story could be, might be, and how it might interface with someone's experience of it. When my first book was published, I was pretty young. I was 26, and I'm Canadian, so we only have really one national newspaper. And I got a really, really mean review in that one national newspaper. And I was so upset, and I felt so vulnerable, too. I was so young. And I called my editor and I started crying. I was like sobbing. I couldn't even get out the words, like, bad review. I'm talking, and suddenly she's not there anymore, like she's not answering. And I realized that my tears and my snot had short-circuited the phone.
I thought she was just taking out the good part of the background.
And I thought, is it worth it? Is it worth the broken phone? Like, is it really? I have to go and buy a new phone now, you know? Like, and I think that was a good learning experience, yeah.
And then the thing is, your perspective of the bad review is so different than your editors. So if there's one kind sentence in that review, they've already called it out for the for the back of the book. So. And then they're concerned about things like their placing. They're like, well, we're on page 3 in the Times. It's not like the last page, or, you know. So you also get, you know, like the complicated view of like what it means to. It's like, it's great that you're reviewed at all, right? So it has different layers. Yeah.
I have a question that directly relates to that awesome question that was just asked, which is, how does it affect your process, do you think, to be writers with a publication history, so that time when you're in the dark room looking for the doorknob, you don't feel as that same sense of solitude that you might have felt like you feel more forces outside of you? How do you feel that affects the process of that? You know, it's so solitary, the first draft of a book, but when you have a publication history, you might hear other voices more. How do you deal with that?
Well, I think for me, the only way it affects it is that you, like, I'm afraid of repetition. Like, I don't want to repeat myself. So I'm more conscious of like, oh, I wrote that story already. So that part of it enters the room. But I've always said, I used to say to younger writers, like, treasure this time where it's just you and your story. And then I realized that doesn't really exist anymore in this age of like people are sharing online and things of that nature. But it is a wonderful, intimate time when you feel like you're just writing for yourself and it's just you, and there's that excitement of the first thing. But yeah, there are things that maybe when you're just starting out you would have felt like bold and trying to write, and then you feel like that you may not write the same kind of story because you feel more vulnerable. They might be like, oh, this is her juvenilia or something. So the voices do come in, you know, they do come in the room with you. But my primary one is always like repetition. It's like, I don't want to repeat myself.
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, I have this maybe sort of naive thought that you can always find that room again, like that room where it's only just you and the text, that it's almost that muscle of repetition that happens every time you go in and sit down to work. It almost is stronger than anything else, and I feel like it's both the refuge and it's both the refuge that you know and the place where something new comes into being. So I almost wouldn't give it up for anything. I think it's true. It takes a lot of mental discipline to push out all those voices. And I agree with you entirely that the useful critique, and the not wanting to repeat, I think that's a really powerful force. And it's in that space where the other voices then go away that I can find what it is that is ongoing in my conversation with literature and myself about what I want to say and do and make. We were talking about Dionne Brand earlier, and I remember when I was very young, this extraordinary poet and novelist Dionne Brand, she was giving a workshop, and I was her photocopy person. So I just sat in the corner of the room, and if she needed a photocopy, I would leap up and do it, basically. But she didn't ever need any, so I just got to sit there. But she talked about how she saw all of her work as part of one larger work, and each piece was in conversation with the one before. It's part of this bigger trajectory, and that you really know the dimensions and possibilities of what this larger work is. And I always carried that. I still feel that with my work.
Actually, think listening to you talk about this notion of that refuge of returning, I think even if we don't acknowledge it, we must somehow believe it. Like you must somehow believe, I must somehow believe it, because otherwise we might be too terrified of crying to start again, right? There's a part of you that even whether you acknowledge it or not has to believe that, oh, this is just for me, right? And because then you would walk in, would be frozen by the notion of all that's to come, of the editing, of the critiques, of the review, of all that. That we have to believe in some way that, and maybe the pull of the work does that, like it gives you a shield, and that you feel like, I'm so immersed in this that it is just me and it.
You mentioned crying. And both of you make people cry. If you've read their work. Why. Well, in part because you've written about massacres, right? The farming of bones, Dogs in the Perimeter, the massacre in Cambodia. But you both have also written about other kinds of violence, interpersonal violence, other kinds of death and pain. Of course, your recent book, The Art of Death. And so I have kind of a multi-part question, thinking this concept of the voices of the other people, of the potential audience, perhaps. How do you deal as mature writers with the power that you have to manipulate the feelings of your audience? Because I'm sure people come up to you and said, "Oh my gosh, I wept when I read such and such." And then also with that, kind of how do you decide what to leave unsaid? Because so much of the violence that you talk about, or the sadness that you talk about, is the people who have gone through it. Many of them cannot speak it. Right? And so you have taken that on to speak it. How do you decide what to kind of leave by the wayside? And then the third part is, how do you take care of yourself as you're kind of living and reliving and writing and rewriting?
What was the first part again? Yeah, just give us more time. All right. I think with Dogs at the Perimeter, which was a very, very difficult book for me, it's about the Cambodian genocide, and, for those of you who were too young, 1/3 of the population of Cambodia was lost. It's a very little remembered genocide. It was 2.5 million tons of American bombs were dropped on Cambodia, a country that America was not actually at war with. It was part of the sideshow with the Vietnam War, what was called the sideshow. And how do you write about this genocide that, if you could capture it in words, you would have entirely failed? It cannot. It must overflow any kind of boundary you try to put upon it. And I think what I thought writing it was, there was this young woman at the center of it, a young woman who we only know her as Janie. She arrives in Canada as a refugee, and she takes what she thinks of as a Canadian name. And we only get the briefest moments of memory before the war begins, during the genocide, and then the way she gets out of Cambodia. And my sense was that this was a young woman, and the escape route that I gave her as a child did not actually exist in 1977. So this was an impossible escape route, which she would not have survived. And what I thought I was writing was the story of what someone's life might have been if this escape had been possible, if the continuation of life had been possible. And because I try to write with a kind of clarity, which the reader can take in as beauty, now we have a problem. Because there's nothing beautiful about this. But I also need the reader to be able to turn each page, to be able to stay with this character, and to go through the gaps and what's seen and not seen. And for me, it was kind of trying to get to some essence of language. And always to only tell what she would tell. Never to trespass into what she could never say or never tell. And that was sort of the way I tried to find my way through it. It was a question actually I had for Edwidge too. It's how to put language around these things that have no language. Even how to describe things for which we don't even really have the language to describe the structures that we're looking at sometimes.
I had a similar feeling writing The Farming of Bones, which is, even in the process of beginning to address the subject, was a massacre of cane workers, but between 15 and 40,000 people who were killed in 1937. And so I remember when I decided I was going to write it, I attempted it in a story called 1937 that's in Crick Crack, because I felt like I was, that was a way in. And the biggest thing was finding a way in, because I knew I couldn't tell the story of like 15 to 40,000 people, and every single person would have an individual story. So, and I remember when Amabel, that character, came to me, and it strikes me very strongly what you're saying about like limiting it to what one person could see. And then I thought, and it was liberating when I found that's like, okay, this one person who is in this one place will, and I thought, and she came when I read about this woman who worked in the home of a military family, and the night the order was given for the massacre to start, it was an actual person, this woman, then the colonel she worked for killed her to prove his loyalty after she had made his dinner. And then I remember thinking, okay, I'm going to write that woman, but she'll live to tell her story. And that whole thing opened the book for me when I had that point of entry, when I had one person, because it also narrowed it down. And I remembered also reading Anne Frank's diary when I was in high school, and I thought that opened up that subject to me, and I kept thinking of that, the power of a single narrative of a person placed in a certain position to tell. We won't know the whole story, but we will know what it was like for one person to go through. And then there's also a journey in The Farming of Bones. And so when you talk about self-care, it was when the book just was just published, I remember I would just sob at all the readings, which was ridiculous, because it was just and people would afterwards say, oh my God, you were moved by your own book. But I was mourning, and I was mourning because I felt like no matter what I write, it's not going to be close to what it was like for one person to live that experience. So I did feel the silences, but I felt like also when you write this singular, if you have this huge amount of casualties, you also feel like writing the story that you have to leave room for other people's stories, right? So that it doesn't shut down other narratives. So I felt like that too, that the singular, the first person, allowed for that space. And so these are the silences, that there will always be silences. And And in that kind of narrative, you have to allow that it's not going to be resolved. Like you're not going to have a clear ending, because thousands and thousands of people did not have that kind of resolution. But for me, it was just very important to write something that other, like if other stories came along, they could stand next to it, and they could reinforce and complement and grow the narrative of that particular, actual event.
Thanks for sharing that. I was wondering, since you've both written about loss, I guess on a personal level, your mother's different things, how would you mind talking a little bit about the process of writing, I guess, your own story, or is there different inner life that has to go on when you're writing like that?
Well, going from, sort of like that bigger canvas, certainly writing about fictional people or going through all this research and coming up with and inventing a person is very different than writing about your own personal loss. For example, writing about the death of my mother or the death of my father is writing also about myself, right? And you have to be fully vulnerable, a full participant in that. I mean, there are sort of literary skills that we've learned to kind of skate around that. I felt like in The Art of Death, I gave myself this other, like the criticism part of it, like writing about books and all of that, to kind of take the pressure off, right? There are ways that we can go about it, but you're still doing like a self-autopsy, which is different than compiling information, and so that part of it is very raw, and it's super vulnerable, and you have to go in it knowing that. You have to go within it knowing that. And one of the things in both of Brother, I'm Dying and in this book, I was also very self-conscious not to be overindulgent, like to also realize, okay, this is my loss, and I can only use the skills that I've already learned from writing other things to make people care about it, but they don't have to care, and that sense of what's healing for you may not be healing for other people. And so there's still, you said something earlier about still trying to make a piece of art. It's like, so it's not like I'm transcribing my therapy session, right? And so that's the trick, to be like, this is still part of this big work that I'm doing. This is also a chunk of it, and and those things also have to be present about it. There's certain kind of, it still has to work as a piece of like art.
I shy away from nonfiction so much. I'm not sure I'll ever write a nonfiction book. Maybe essays or criticism. Never say never. But I will, I would say that, The Art of Death, I already told Edwidge that The Art of Death has meant so much to me. It's a book that I really turned to in a difficult time. And to see your vulnerability and honesty in that book, but also the way you connected looking at death and mourning and love to literature, to wider acts, to slavery, to genocides, you looked at it in so many different ways, pulling the gaze out, bringing the gaze in. And I think that really helped me at the time that I read it. And yeah, I don't even know how to talk about it. It's still a bit too raw for me to get. You're still thinking a lot about your book, and a writer who was here last night, Yun Lee. She has a book, Dear Friend, From My Life I Write to You in Your Life. Both fiction writers, both who put these very vulnerable works into the world, and both of which really have meant a lot to me, because I think they travel through the. Is it Orhan Pamuk's Nobel Prize speech, where he talks about, as a writer, first you travel through the books of others. And it felt like that, continuing this traveling together as writers through books, as readers, as people struggling with these questions.
Questions for each other?
We'll do that in private. Actually, I want to know, like, you seem to also, you said you don't write nonfiction, but you've written some personal narratives that you then also interweave with some visual images. I want to, if you would talk about the role of the visual, like actual visual work in your work.
Oh yeah, you know, it's it comes from a very funny thing, which is that I had to do these lectures, and I really don't like it when people look at me. So I thought, what I would do is have some sort of film installation thing going on in the background, which they would have to look at, and my essay would be a kind of film sound installation essay thing that would work together, and I would just be like a voice, but what they would really be looking at is this. And it was wonderful for me because it let me play with, I think, a question that I really struggle with, which is the limitations of language, and what it is that language can't say, and what we shouldn't expect language to do, or how we distort language when we try to get it to do these things, and so on. But also that I live by language. I mean, I don't mean economically. I mean, it's the way I think. It's the way that I think through the world. But I found I really liked the process of collage. I really liked working with film technique. I really liked the conjunctions and disjuncture, is that a word? Disjunctions? Between image and sound. And it helped me too because I was writing a book that was so much about music. And also thinking about, like, how do you technically describe the experience of music? Do you just technically describe what's happening with the chords and the keys and the key changes and all this stuff? No, I felt I needed to describe it for these musicians as experience, you know, as narrative, as being, as something they were feeling all the time. And so I think working through those multimedia things helped me write the book about music.
And I also want to say, Ayon Lee was here and nobody told me. I love her.
Happening, unfortunately. Hi. I know that both of you are currently very robust writers, but for all of us out here, if you could give some advice to your younger writer self that you would hope that they would take, what would you tell yourselves?
Just write, like, don't wait for permission, and really, like, discipline, like, give yourself, make it a practice, right, that you, like, something, like everybody, musicians we know practice the piano, right, and so make it a practice, sit down and actually write. And sometimes you know, you're going to get rejected, you're going to get a certain kind of response that might be discouraging, but just do it. I think it's just, and you have just like to believe that you have a story to tell. I've, you know, in my teaching, I've met people who've left everything behind to come into a program to write. And to them, it was like a matter of life and death. Like, it was so, it was such a compelling drive. And so, the space too, like if you're in a writing group or if you're in a program, the fellowship of that is something that's very valuable, and also to use while you're here, and then try to learn tools from that you can then carry into the solitary room with you. But it's the one thing in the process that nobody else is going to be able to do for you is the writing, right? And to do it and to try to get it to the best point that you can.
Yeah, I would echo all of that. I think and I would also say, like, don't be afraid of the questions that the work brings up. Don't feel that the process of craft is about trying to eliminate those questions or try to make them feel as if they've been answered. that they will keep feeding each other and feeding your work as you get older, and it takes a lot of courage, I think, the writing life, but it also gives back so much. It is the examined life very much.
To piggyback on that, like not to be afraid of the discomfort, right? Of the the personal unease of it, because there are some things that sometimes even your body will resist, and like of not wanting to, and to be able to feel brave enough to go to those difficult places. That I think that's also very important.
Questions. What I'm going to do is take both of them, and then they'll live in the ether a little bit, and you can kind of choose which one to answer. So there's one, and then
Have you ever received harsh criticism from your own family members or friends? If so, how do you deal with it? Like, did you ever get your feelings hurt? And how do you develop a thick skin?
feelings ever get hurt? And second question as well.
How do you market your individuality and like avoid cliches and being just another blank type of writer?
When you say market, can you explain what you mean?
For example, a bunch of people will write something similar. How do you make yourself stand out, and how do you know to tell people to make yourself stand out?
Do you mean in the writing or
In
after
the-
the writing?
After the writing.
After the writing. Thank you.
Well, the harsh criticism, we talked a little about criticism earlier, but I think the harshest criticism do come from the one you might most fear is the one from the people you love the most, right? And so for my brothers, like I remember when I wrote Brother, I'm Dying, because it's the only one book that my brothers are in. So I said, I want you to read it. And if you don't like it, and so I think one of my brothers, my youngest brothers, said, "Oh, you wrote it exactly like it happened." And to me, that was like the highest praise. I was like, yes, he likes it. Because it would be harder to take, like, if someone you really, I think, like, the outside criticism is another story. You're right, like, the people closest to you. But you still have to shake that off as well, right? Because the people closest to you are going to be critical for different reasons than craft. They're going to be, so you have to investigate for yourself where their criticism is coming from, and that's a very complicated thing, especially if you're writing a memoir, if you're writing about them. In terms of the individuality, like I said, I feel like in all of that, we're in a capitalist society. We are marketed, and often as writers of color, we're marketed a certain way, even if we're not participating in that. But all I can do is write the thing that I write, and I can't, like I keep saying, that's the only part of it that I am in full control of, is the thing that I'm writing, and then you just have to, in terms of, one way that I've tried from the beginning, for example, with my story, I've always felt like it's a better story if it's not being told in a void. So then after my book came out, I edited anthologies of other Haitian writers, because I feel like a full picture emerges if people are hearing other types of people who come from the same place as me, but they're telling other stories. So they're like, oh, this, so I feel like that's a fuller narrative. I don't know if that's marketing myself or individuality, but I feel like that creates a fuller field, a better way for people to understand the kind of story that I'm telling. So, but again, like the most individual part of the process for me has always been like what I do. Like that's the only part that is mine. The rest, the way the book is sold, what part of the bookstore it's in, I have no control over.
Yeah, which part of the bookstore? That's a very good point. about the family. You know, my mom was alive when I published my first book, and I came home I went to my mom's place one day, and it was like a paperback. It was so pretty, my first book, and there was a little girl on the cover, and she was putting her hair behind her ear. And I was sitting at my mom's dining table, and I looked down, and I realized my mom had used my book to hold up one of the table legs. So, like, the actual table leg was right on the little girl's face. And I was like, Mom, that's my first book. And she's keeping it real. And then she was like, yeah, but it was the right size. And what I came to feel was that I found it very funny in the moment, but it was kind of beautiful. I mean, the dining table was where we all met. The dining table is where she put out the food that she cooked for us. The dining table was the most important, and she had used it to keep it steady, which I thought was kind of amazing. And then she later told me that what had moved her the most about the first book of short stories was that because I had borrowed a bit from life, a little bit, and she said it made her feel like she hadn't been so alone in those difficult years, and that there had been some observation and understanding in the family that made her feel less lonely in hindsight. And about the marketing part, it's, I think Edwidge's answer is pretty spot on. That is the one thing you can do is control the work, and or you can't even control the work, but it's where your intelligence and your thoughts and your selfhood are, and I know as a reader, so just to turn it around, I respond to work where I feel there's a vision and a voice and a deep way of thinking and a way of looking out at the world and into oneself. That is what I'm drawn to, and for me that is more important than any of the marketing around it. Because I think a lot of readers, and I hope this will continue always to be, they go in search of these books. I know that marketing creates gaps, and God knows I know the injustice of a lot of it, and the difficulty sometimes of breaking through the categories that people put around you. But I just can't write with that in my head. Yeah.
And there are also now these ways that readers connect, right? To continue that thing with sort of the fellowship of readers and like-minded readers who guide each other through other books. So there's this other thing that also happens, I think, beyond official marketing, and the ways that not just writers find each other anymore, online and so forth, but also that readers who think, like you see all these things, people like, tell me your go-to books, and then but I think there's also this exciting conversation that happens around readers who love a particular kind of book too, that I feel like even people always tell me, like, I know you'll love this book, like, so, and there are all these ways also of sharing that among readers.
A great way to end our conversation between writers is talking about conversations between readers, so let's thank them. The director of the Wolf Institute for the Humanities, for directing all of what happened this week, and Safima Roy for being the administrator to help make things happen. And as this is the last event, let's please give Edwidge Danticat another round.